Good day and greetings. This is Dr. Charles Cotter. I'd like to welcome you to episode 2 of the Management Makeover series. The focus of episode 2 is to look at 3 of the primary management functions: planning, organizing, and control. And as you'll recall from episode 1, we did say the purpose of the series is to refine and improve on your management skills in 7 identified principles. I'm also hopeful that you'll join me for the subsequent episodes 3 to 7, and also hope that you find value from viewing episode 2, the planning, the organizing, and control best practices. Thank you.
Okay, so let's start off with planning. And I think you'll agree with me, planning is the genesis of the work of management, the management functions. We often say you have to plan your work and then you work your plan. So when you talk about working your plan, we're talking about organizing. So planning, probably the best known framework that we could use for planning. I'm sure you're familiar with it. What we call the 4 whiskeys and a hotel. So it starts off, your planning framework will start off with the what. So when we talk about the what, we're talking about the objectives. So what are the objectives that we need to achieve? So when you look at learning activity 1, what I'd like you to do is to identify, because you will be from different organizations, different industries and sectors, try to identify a generic management task and then just engage in a discussion. Typically, what are some of the planning actions that we need to include for that specific generic management task? So what are the objectives? And I think you also recognize the SMART acronym. So when we start crafting and formulating objectives, we need to make sure that those objectives are specific, they're measurable, they're achievable, realistic, and time-bound. So I don't expect you to do that this morning. I don't expect you to get the formulation of your objectives word perfect. Just be mindful that your objectives need to be SMART. So that is the what needs to be achieved, what are the objectives. The second component of this planning framework is, of course, the how. So the how will then stipulate what are the tasks and what are the subtasks that need to be completed to enable us to achieve that particular objective. Again, we don't have a lot of time this morning, so perhaps we could just focus on the main tasks. You don't necessarily need to drill down and look at the subtask, but to complete that task, to achieve those objectives, what are the main tasks? And of course, we could break that down into the subtasks that are required to perform that particular task, to achieve that particular objective, etc. So that's the what and the how. For each of those tasks, we need to assign responsibility. So the second W, of course, is the who. So we have the what, the how, and the who. So we need to assign responsibility for the performance of each of those identified tasks and, of course, those subtasks. And of course, the third W is, of course, when. And I think you'll agree with me, the planning framework, the target date is very important. So each of those main tasks and subtasks need to be completed in a particular time frame. And of course, that will then be the when. And of course, the modern planning framework, the fourth W then, of course, is the wait. So that is how well each of those tasks need to be performed. Different organizations will use different terminology, but typically we could talk about your key performance indicators. So the key performance indicators are a numerical, quantitative indicator of performance, how well those tasks should be performed. And that is the modern way of planning. It's an integrated planning, but also it helps you then as a manager when you then migrate to the control function, because it helps you to understand what the yardstick is. So when you exercise the control function, which I'll get to very shortly, I'm going to refer to the MERC acronym, MERC. We need to monitor, we need to evaluate, we need to report, and we need to control. So in exercising that control function, you can then compare the actual performance to the targeted or the planned performance. And this is typically the control process that we can see. So these key performance indicators or these performance standards that have been incorporated into your planning framework, we need to compare the actual to the planned performance. And I think, let's be honest, 80% of the time there are deviations. The plan doesn't go 100% according to the plan. Never runs smoothly. And of course, it might require some sort of corrective action just to redirect or correct that particular deviation. So I think that's typically the inextricable link then between planning and control. You cannot plan in isolation to organizing. You cannot plan in isolation to control. And I think we'll position leading as the foundation, because leading is probably embedded throughout the management functions, because when we plan, there are elements of leadership. When we organize, the same, and even when we control, we need to be exercising and flexing our leadership muscles, etc. So what I would like you to discuss in terms of planning, and again, if you could just allocate maybe 6 or 7 minutes, we don't have more time than that. If you could allocate 6 or 7 minutes just to unpack, what would you say are some of the key planning considerations when it comes to that specific identified generic management task? And again, I would recommend that you use this well-recognized planning framework, the 4 whiskies in a hotel: what, how, who, when, and of course the weight. So spend about 6 to 7 minutes on that. Like we said, you first plan your work and then you need to work your plan. So when we talk about working your plan, we then transition to organizing. And again, similar to planning, with organizing, there are 5 pivotal points. You're welcome to jot this down. It is in the ebook, it is in the notes there. But typically, when we talk about organizing, we talk about the first pivotal point is structure. So when we talk about structure, we talk about organizational structure. And we often talk about the organizational design, but also we talk about the work structure. And that is where we talk about job design. So typically the outcome of the structural guidelines is, of course, to have a chain of command. So that's vertically, but also horizontally, you need to have a chain of command. And we often borrow a bit from project management here. So at a work structural level, we might use a work breakdown structure. I think it's very important that we use some of those tools. The second pivotal point of organizing is, of course, governance. Now, when we talk about governance, we're talking about decision-making authority. So we know that as manager, and at a middle manager, you certainly have delegated powers and authority. And when it goes beyond those thresholds, we of course have to escalate that to our senior, our top management team, etc. So decision-making authority, delegated powers and authority, a very important function within that, of course, of the governance framework. But also we know from a performance perspective, we need to have performance work plans, we need to have performance contracts, performance agreements. Different organizations will call it differently, but we have to have job descriptions, we have to have job specifications, we have to have policies, we have to have procedures, standard operating procedures on how certain work is performed, workflow, etc. So this is typically all the sub-functions within this governance framework, which is a very important pivot of course, the organizational management function. The third pivot that we need to talk about, of course, is scheduling and sequencing. So your plan will typically just include a target date. So sub-task 2 needs to be completed within 3 months, but within that 3-month time period, we don't specify the sequencing of tasks. So we know that certain tasks have to be performed. There are predecessors, there are successors. So we need to coordinate and we need to pinpoint the scheduling and sequencing. And again, those of you that work a lot in projects, we often use what we call a Gantt chart. And a Gantt chart will help us then to schedule and sequence those various work functions to enable us to make sure that the work does get done on time and that there aren't any delays, or we often talk about the lag performance indicators, that we don't have inefficiency in our processes. The fourth pivotal point in terms of organizing is, of course, the allocation of resources. So like we said, we need to assign responsibility in the planning function. However, to enable performance, we need to make sure that our team members are allocated the resources. And that's why I want us to look at resource optimization very shortly. And the fifth pivotal point, which we're going to get to after our tea break this morning, is, of course, the delegation of tasks. So we're not talking about the delegation of powers. We're talking about the delegation of tasks. Because I think as a manager, you'll agree, you cannot be expected to do everything. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time after tea on looking at the 5-step task delegation process. So I want to park that one for later on. But in your group discussion, again, for 6 or 7 minutes, perhaps you could look at how you're going to structure the work. You don't necessarily need to look at how you're going to structure the organization, because this is a generic task. So I want you to discuss some of the considerations when it comes to the structuring of the work. I want you to discuss the governance in terms of job descriptions, performance plans and agreements, standard operating procedures, decision-making authority, maybe delegating autonomy to some of your team members. The scheduling and sequencing, I'd like you to discuss the allocation of resources. And I want you to park the delegation, because we're going to do that with Learning Activity 2, Session 2, Learning Activity 2. We'll get to that. So if you could spend about 6 or 7 minutes looking at structured governance, the scheduling and sequencing, but also the allocation of resources. So that then collectively constitutes the organizational management function. And then, like I said, the control function, essentially, I want you to look at how you can apply. Again, spend about 6 or 7 minutes on that. I want you to discuss how you can apply the MERC acronym, MERC. So the monitoring, the evaluation, the reporting, but also the control, and in particular, the control tools that you will use, control process. I've got that illustrated right now. I've navigated you through that process where you detect the deviations, planned versus actual performance, and of course, the corrective action that you need to take. Again, you'll see this is illustrated as a cyclical process. And of course, when you do look at the control principles, the process, the toolkit, and the control systems, because a lot of the control systems should be automated to promote efficiency. So in harmonizing these management functions, the planning, the organizing, the leading, and controlling, in particular, when you focus on planning, organizing, and control, I think it's very clear. When you look at planning, what we want to achieve with planning is we want direction and we want focus. When it comes to organizing, I think you'll agree with me, and almost the golden thread that links those 5 pivotal points is, of course, coordination. So you cannot talk about organizing in absence of coordination. And I think, like I said, coordination is the golden thread that links those 5 pivotal points. So when you exercise the organizational management function, you want efficiency. You don't want duplication. You want to avoid duplication. You want to streamline your processes in particular. You want uniformity. You want standardization. And I think it's very clear you want orderliness. So organization will give you that. And of course, control, like we said, the purpose of control is we want to make sure that the plan is achieved. So at the output level, so if you go back to the systems thinking model, at the output level, you want to make sure that you achieve 100% of your goals. If compliance is one of your business metrics and objectives, you want to make sure you achieve 100% compliance. It could be quality, it could be innovation, it could be financial performance. It really depends on your business model, but control will give you that assurance that you have indeed achieved the outputs. And of course, if you subscribe to the best practice organizations, when you look at outcomes, control of the outcomes. So not just profitability, but also the socioeconomic, sociocultural outcomes. And of course, through your corporate social investment. And of course, like we said, the ecological, the green environment, you want to reduce your carbon footprint. A lot of organizations have gone paperless. And of course, you want to reduce your emissions through your production process. I know some of you are in a production process, your carbon footprint, you want to reduce that as much as possible. And that would then that would enable you to control whether you achieve the outputs, but also the outcomes.
This is Dr. Charles Cotter signing out. I'd like to say thank you for viewing the very short video clip, Management Functions, in particular planning, organizing, and control. At this point, I'd also like to encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube learning channel and also click the notify button to be alerted of upcoming content uploads. The next episode of this very short management series will focus on the productivity improvement strategies using the LADIO framework, and that will be uploaded during the course of this week. I'd also like to wish you the best of luck on your leadership journey as you actualize towards the leading manager. Best wishes and regards. Thank you. Bye-bye.